Okay, hi, welcome to an episode of the Sixth Age Medieval History Podcast. Hopefully, you are not just joining us for the first time, but if you are, welcome. And yeah, we'll go ahead and dive in. So, last week I promised that we were going to talk about what it was like to be a normal person living through the transition from the Roman world to the medieval world. And that's also what we're going to be talking about today, like I said. So, around the year 500 AD, I want us to really focus in on medieval Italy at this time. Why are we focusing on medieval Italy? Well, medieval Italy is one of the places that experienced the decline and collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the greatest extent. The events and transformational changes that are going on in Italy, are really monumental. If you were living through this time and you were living in Italy, you would have known that the Western Roman Empire was collapsing because of all of the crazy stuff that would have been happening around you. And this is opposed to other places in the Western Roman Empire where around 500s AD, they didn't really know what was going on in Italy. They assumed that maybe the empire would come back. If you were living in Britain or France around 500 AD, you might not know that the Roman heartland, Italy, was just a total mess, right? You might think, well, the Romans will be back in a couple decades. The empire will come back. But if you're living in Italy, you know that the Western Empire is done for good because your day-to-day experience would show you that. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what it would have been like to be your average person living through this period. What we are going to try and shy away from is the experience of powerful people, kings, emperors, bishops. We focused on these guys a lot in this podcast so far, and it's unfortunate, but your average person kind of gets left out, and these people deserve to have their stories told as well. However, telling the stories of your average person in this era is difficult, and it's difficult because your average person did not have access to literacy, and so they have not left us a lot of first-person biographical accounts of what it was like to be, a normal person in this period. The only people who really had access to literacy were either those who were educated enough to write on their own, or they were wealthy enough to hire someone to write for them. And this is really what it's really a reflection of is power in late ancient and early medieval society. People with power are able to ensure that their lives, their names, and their experiences are being recorded. And people without power, without wealth, without education, are not able to ensure that their perspectives are being recorded. So that's why we know, for example, who Charlemagne is, right? Charlemagne had power. And it's why we don't know who the names of Charlemagne's servants were, because they did not have power. They did not have the resources to make sure that their stories were being recorded. They didn't have chroniclers and propagandists recording their every deed the way that some of these bishops, kings, and emperors do. But these people still mattered. Just because they weren't recorded, just because they didn't have power at the time, doesn't make their experience any less important to the human story. They still contributed a lot to medieval society. And so, part of what I want to do in this podcast is, yes, we're going to talk about the big political and religious events going on between the kings, emperors, bishops, those kinds of people. But I also want to talk about average, everyday people. And this is where I'm going to do one of those things that I really shouldn't do as a history podcaster, which is I'm going to make people up. Right? Why do I make people up? I do it because, like I said, we don't have any primary accounts of what it's like to be, a lower class person, an average person in this period. And so without those primary accounts, it's hard for me to really tell a cohesive story. And so what I want to do is give you an example of what it could have been like to be a normal person living in this period. And obviously, these records or it's based on the archaeological record. It's based on tidbits that we do have from more formal written religious and political records. We are able to gather lots of bits and pieces from archaeology. Things like excavating old kitchens, old houses, old fields, and then pulling tidbits from what does get recorded in some religious and political records to come up with a composite image of your average person's life living in Italy around 500 AD. Well, why are we starting in 500 AD? You will remember that 500 AD is after 476 AD, which is when the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed, and control of Italy, it went from being in the hands of the Western Roman Empire to being in the hands of kind of barbarian barbarian kings. Famously, Theodoric the Great eventually seizes control of medieval Italy. Now, there is still an Eastern Roman court, right? There's still an Eastern Roman emperor, and these Eastern Roman emperors will eventually get it into their heads that they need to reconquer Italy from these barbarian kings. It doesn't make any sense to them to let the Roman heartland be in the hands of these barbarians. It's something that they're very opposed to and are not huge fans of. But that doesn't really start until the 540s, 550s. That's really the first time that these Eastern Roman emperors are able to go after Italy and try to reclaim Italy. So, what's it like to live in Italy before that happens? What's it like to live in an Italy ruled by barbarian kings? Well, before we really get into that, I want you to meet the people that we're going to be visiting with this episode. And so the people that I made up is a newlywed couple, a newlywed Roman couple, meaning that they are from the city of Rome itself. The husband in this relationship, his name is Marcus, and the wife in this relationship, her name is Secunda, or she goes by Secunda. Why does she go by Secunda, you ask? Well, her actual name might have been something like Julia or Priscilla, right? But there was this thing in Roman families where they would name all the girls the same thing. You had 5 daughters, you would name them all Julia, for example. Well, if all 5 of your daughters are named Julia, how do you keep them straight? Well, you say, well, this is the first Julia, so Julia Primus. This is the second Julia, Julia Secundus, right? These are that's kind of how they're going about naming their girls, right? It does kind of feel like that in Roman society they didn't really think that women were important enough to deserve their own names, right? Roman society is very, very, very misogynistic at almost every level, right? And so we're gonna see a lot of this in this episode, talking about what it's like to start a family as a Roman woman, going through this time of transformation. But yeah, misogyny is embedded at every level of Roman society, even more so than it is in some barbarian societies. Relatively, barbarian women could have much more rights than Roman women. And barbarian women, as far as we know, tended to also have their own names, right? They weren't sharing their name with every single female relative that they've ever had. So yeah, it's not, if you're a woman and you have to choose between living in a barbarian world or living in a Roman world, you're going to have more legal rights living in a barbarian society, right? But people don't get to choose where they grow up, and such is the case with our Roman woman that we're going to be talking about, Secunda. So Marcus and Secunda, they are both just became adults and they have gotten married. What does it mean to become an adult in Roman society? Well, if you are a Roman man, you become an adult in your late teens, early 20s, usually after you've mastered a trade, you've done an apprenticeship, or you've purchased some land that you can start a family on. Right? And so, in this case, let's say that our hypothetical Roman man, Marcus, learned how to become a baker right? This is a pretty stable trade to have if you're living in the city of Rome, because the city of Rome has a population, or at least at the heyday of the empire, had a population of over 1 million people. And that means that the city of Rome had to churn out over 1 million loaves of bread a day, right? And so if you're a baker, there's going to be plenty of demand for your services, you think. Well, turns out Marcus trained to become a baker at the wrong time. We're going to get to that a little later, but first let's talk about Secunda. Secunda has also just become an adult, but as men in Roman society become adults in their late teens, women in Roman society are considered to be adults in their early teens. Like we are talking as young as 13, 14, 15, right? And as soon as you become an adult in Roman society as a woman, you are getting married off. And so, even though our Roman man, Marcus, might be considered an adult as soon as he turns 20, 21, 22, our Roman woman, Secunda, she could be considered an adult as early as her 13th birthday, right? There's obviously a lot of speculation that you were believed to be marriageable after you had your first menstrual cycle. And so, while by our standards, we would look at this as a child being married to a much older man, we do think that it's repulsive and repugnant. It would have been normal for people living back then. And there's something to be said for the misogyny in Roman society, combined with the fact that Roman women are getting married off and being forced to start bearing children really before they've become full adults, before they're able to make their own decisions. It does, forcing people, having a societal expectation of getting married young does deprive people, especially women, of certain developmental advantages, right? Certain chances to pursue a career or pursue education. It locks them in to basically domestic labor, because if you're a woman after you've had your first child, all your time is going to be consumed by caring for and feeding for your children. And so it is, not, it's not great that Roman women were married off so young, right? And it's not a happy fact by any means. And well, let's dive into what it means to really get married. What does that mean legally? Well, Marcus, our baker friend, before Rome was Christian, if he had lived before Rome was Christianized, all he needed to conduct a marriage would have been the consent of one of Secunda's male relatives, either her father or her brother, whichever one was still alive, right? All he needed to do in this situation to marry a woman was conduct some kind of arrangement with one of these male relatives. And Marcus may have paid a dowry. He may have, arranged some sort of beneficial deal. Long story short is, all he has to do really is shake hands with one of Secunda's male relatives, and boom, they are legally married, right? Um, Now, if you are thinking that we're missing something, it's because we are. We're missing the woman's consent, right? Before Christianity, women did not have to give their consent to be married in order for that marriage to be considered valid. It legally did not matter what the woman thought about her potential future husband. What mattered is whether or not her male relative made a legally binding agreement to marry her off. So that's pretty bleak, right? I mean, imagine you're a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl living in Rome, and you're going about your day, and you come home one day and your dad sits you down and he says, "Hey honey, I decided to marry you off to this guy. You don't know him, but he paid me quite a bit of money, to marry you. And so this is what's happening." And you're like, "Well, I don't know this guy. What if I don't want to marry him?" And your dad goes, "Well, what you want doesn't actually matter, because we're living in Roman society. Roman law means that I get the final say as your father. I'm the pater familias, and you have to do what I tell you to, because you're a girl, you're a woman. You don't have any legal rights to speak of." Now, That's what Roman law says, but there's another factor here because we're talking about Italy in 500 AD. Italy in 500 AD is very different from Italy of 200 AD, and that's because Christianity is now a factor. So by the 500s AD, Christianity is very prevalent among the Roman lower classes, and it's all but taken over the city, right? There are still pagans left around this point, but we call them crypto pagans, which means secret pagans, right? And that's because the Emperor Theodosius I made paganism illegal. He made it illegal to publicly sacrifice to pagan gods. And so you see a really strict persecution of pagans kind of come into effect. And you can see here there's an image of a bust of Aphrodite with a cross carved into her forehead, right? And so this taking apart of paganism is very much in effect in 500 AD. Now, it seems that some of the Roman elite, the highest of the nobility of Roman society, may still have been secret pagans. They may still have been practicing pagan rites and pagan rituals in their homes at this point. Why is paganism prevalent among the Roman elite rather than the Roman lower classes, you're wondering? Well, the elite tended to have more of a connection to the ancestor gods of Rome, people like Jupiter, right, who had presided over the great heydays of the Roman Senate and the great expansion of the Roman Empire. And it really is the elite who do seem to resist the conversion to Christianity the most, and they kind of are dragged along this path towards Christianization by the emperors and by the Roman military, who really embraced Christianity wholeheartedly. The lower classes really also embraced Christianity, and it's not just because Christianity had a theological importance placed upon the poor and the meek. It is also because Christianity, the Christian church, is the only social safety net around. If you are a lower class person and for whatever reason you don't have enough coins to buy your daily bread, you go to the church and they will give you free food. And that is it's hard to overstate how transformational that is. Imagine you are living in Rome in, 300, 400 AD, and you are down on your luck. Things are tough. Nothing is working out. And then all of a sudden, you see this guy who's got a weird haircut because he's wearing a tonsure, giving out bread for free, giving out wine for free. And you're like, this is strange. What's going on here? I'm interested in this. Sign me up for more of the free food, please. It turns out that this new Christian church, they think that God wants you to take care of poor people. Blowing your mind, right? This is the best thing you've ever heard of. And so, because of this kind of tradition of charity and charitable giving, Christianity really takes hold among the lower classes of Roman society. So by 500 AD, we can say that our average everyday Roman man and woman is very much a Christian. How does this affect marriage? Well, now you can't just, marriage isn't just a legal contract. You have to have a Christian priest performing the marriage sacrament, right? There's a new theological importance placed on marriage that didn't necessarily exist under pagan society. And interestingly enough, the Christian clergy, because they have placed all this theological importance on marriage, they consider marriage to be a sacrament. The Christian clergy actually are the ones who say, okay, well, before I marry you guys, we should make sure that the wife in question is good with it, right? And this is a new concept in Roman society. We're asking a woman how she feels about a potential marriage? What? Crazy. Right. And so what extent do women actually get to choose their partners? To a very low extent, right? This is a small baby step in the direction of women's liberation. It does not change the fact that your father, if you're a 13-year-old girl, your father can still betroth you to a much older man, right? The only thing that really changes is that when it comes down to it, and the priest is performing the marriage, he's going to turn to you and give you a chance to say that you do not want to marry that man, right? How much of a chance? Not a very big one, because you're still going to be under a ton of familial pressure to go through with this marriage, right? You may know that your father may punish you if you fail to go through with this marriage, right? And so that you're under an immense amount of pressure to say I do instead of saying I object, right? And so you don't really have that much more freedom to choose your partner. You just have the freedom to say no and potentially suffer the consequences. Whereas under Roman law, without the Christian clergy, you did not have that freedom. But you're still a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl who's still getting married to a much older man, and you still have all this familial pressure, so you probably aren't going to say no to this marriage 9 times out of 10, even if the guy sucks, even if you don't really know him, you know? But let's assume that the guys that we're talking about, Marcus, let's assume that he's a good guy, right? Even though he's older, even though by our standards there are no circumstances where a relationship between a man in his 20s and a girl in her early teens would be appropriate, for the sake of argument, we have to let's assume that this relationship could actually work out, right? These people could actually uh, build a family together. Well, as soon as they get married, they have to build a life together. There's no like honeymoon period in the 500s AD. It is you get married and you guys are starting your new life together. You are moving into your new house. You are moving to your new farm. You are getting crops in the ground. You are getting right into it. Well, Marcus is a baker. So what does he want to do? He wants to start a bakery. He wants to start baking bread for money, right? Well, there's a problem. Uh, the Western Roman Empire has just collapsed. Well, what does that mean if you're living in the city of Rome? It means that the imperial grain shipments are not happening. And that is a problem. Rome, at the height of the empire, had more than 1 million people, right? We are talking about a very, very densely populated area. For the ancient world, potentially Rome is the largest city, before the modern age, right? And that's really saying something. And the way that Rome was able to support this large urban population was by importing a ton of grain from Egypt and North Africa. Because the Romans, part of the reason they got into the whole empire thing is because they knew that farming sucked, right? And it's like, hey, if we conquer people, we can make them farm for us, and then we can just extract their grain and use it to support these large cities like Rome or like Constantinople. And when the empire was divided into an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, Rome kind of got screwed out of the deal because Rome was included in the Western Empire. And the places where the grain shipments were coming from were considered part of the Eastern Empire. And so the Eastern Empire is still getting these grain shipments from North Africa, from Egypt. The Western Empire is in a little bit of trouble. And then when the Western Empire finally collapses, there is no grain getting to Rome. And so we see the population of Rome go from 1 million people at its height to potentially less than 30,000 people by 500 AD. Well, that's a huge shift, right? And it's not just that there's no grain in Rome. Like, it's not just that 900,000 people starved to death, because if that had happened, we would know about it, right? Really, it's a mix of things. As the grain shipments kind of petered out, people moved to the countryside to start farming, to start raising food to feed themselves, right? And we also know that a potentially substantial group of the Roman population were actually taken prisoner, taken as slaves during the two sacks of Rome that happened in the 5th century A.D. Rome was sacked in 410, I want to say, by the Goths, and then sacked again later on by the Vandals. And both these groups obviously took a lot of prisoners. Anyone that they captured, they would take with them as slaves. And unless your family was able to pony up a ransom to buy you out of slavery, you could spend the rest of your life as a slave, and you could have children who would also be slaves, right? So between the outmigration from the city of Rome to the countryside, and between the two sacks of Rome in the 5th century, the Roman population has decreased substantially. So if you're living in Rome in 500 AD, you are walking around seeing these massive temples, these massive arenas, and you're wondering how there were ever enough people to fill any of these spaces, right? It would boggle your mind a little bit to imagine what it would be like to live in a city of 1 million people if you've never experienced that, right? Because the only cities in the Roman world that really exist after the fall of the Western Roman Empire are still in the East. And so while Constantinople is a huge city, most people aren't traveling to Constantinople. They have no idea what it would be like to see a city of over 1 million people, to see what those buildings would be like. And if you're living in Rome after the population downturn, it's kind of a ghost city. You know, a lot of abandoned ruins, abandoned pagan temples that are maybe in the process of being rebranded as Christian churches, right? Abandoned amphitheaters, abandoned government buildings. And while some of these buildings were taken over by the barbarian kings who conquered Italy and tried to a certain extent to administer Roman institutions in Italy, they didn't do a great job, right? You know, it's not like they were able to re-administer the Italian Roman bureaucracy or anything, right? So a lot of these places are being abandoned. Less grain is coming in. The only people that are really staying in Rome are the Roman elite who are able to buy grain at very high prices, or they have some agricultural estates outside the city that they're able to use to make sure that themselves and their households are being fed. But if you're an average Joe like Marcus, and you've just become a baker, right? If there's no grain in Rome, you got nothing to bake. You're out of luck. You've gone into a dying industry. Well, what do you do in that situation? You have to do what everyone else is doing. You have to take your brand new wife and go to the countryside looking for agricultural work. What does this actually look like? Well, we're going to talk about a new mode, a new economic system, really. It's called manorialism. What is manorialism? Well, in the Italian countryside, you've got all these Roman villas, and these Roman villas are owned by the uber powerful, uber wealthy. They are supported by vast agricultural estates that are being worked on by the lower classes, right? And so your villa is at the center of your estate, and that's where you live if you're the uber wealthy, uber rich, powerful Roman magnate, right? And then you've got your surrounding area that's being worked by your servants and your slaves, and you're making money by selling off excess produce. Any produce that your household does not consume, you're making money by selling it on the open market. Well, as the great cities of the West are collapsing and people are fleeing into the countryside looking for food, these villa owners start getting an idea. They're like, hey, I've got all this land. All these people are begging for the chance to work on my land so that they can at least eat. Why don't I lease some of this land out to them? Except it's not quite, what we would think of as a modern renter's arrangement. Roman law had this institution, the institution of serfdom. This is something that's instituted under the Emperor Constantine. What does it mean to be a serf? Well, serfdom was a kind of legal contract that you could enter into with a landowner, where the landowner would grant you a parcel of land that you could farm on, but the land isn't yours. Even though you're making improvements to it, like you might be building houses, you might be farming there, you might be putting up fences there, you could be putting up barns there. Even though you're putting improvements on it, it's not your land. That land belongs to the villa owner, the landlord, right? And so, what does the landlord get in exchange for letting you live on this land and farm on this land? Well, he gets a share of your harvest, and he gets the right to exploit you for unpaid labor, right? So if I'm a landlord and I've parceled out my estate to a bunch of serfs, every once in a while I get to go around and be like, hey, since I'm letting you live on my land and letting you farm on my land, I get 25% of your harvest, and I get to force you to go build a bridge for me, right? What do the serfs really get out of this? Well, they get to not starve to death, right? It's a pretty crappy deal because the serfs are making all these improvements to the land, right? But they're not getting any of the benefits from that. They can still be evicted from their land by their landlord. And under the Emperor Constantine, a lot of these serfs would abandon their estates to try and find a better landlord. And this was becoming a problem. So, what does Constantine do? He makes it illegal for someone who has become a serf to leave their land without the permission of their landlord. And what this does is it ties the peasantry to the land legally. If you run away, you can be hunted, you will be hunted down, you can be prosecuted, you can be beaten, you may even be executed. Right? So, okay, that's not great, right? If you're a medieval peasant who's become a serf because you have no other options, uh, you are subject to being exploited for your labor by your landlord, and at any time, your landlord could take your land away, evict you from your land, take the fruits of your labor, and use them for his own purposes, right? Well, there is a little bit of a balancing institution, and that institution is, again, the Christian church. So, one of the only institutions that people continue to interact with on a daily basis after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was the Christian church. The Christian church was the only thing that was acting as anything like a social safety net, right? The Christian church is the only institution really left that's like, okay, we've got a lot of hungry people. Let's see if we can get these guys some bread. Let's make sure they don't starve, right? Jesus wouldn't want good Christians to starve, so we shouldn't let good Christians starve. So the Christian church does take an active role in the lives of the medieval peasantry and medieval serfs. And not only are they interacting with the lower classes by giving them food, but they're also seeing the lower classes on a weekly basis in church. People have to go to church on a weekly basis. So if you're a evil landlord, say, and you are just out to abuse your serfs, you are out to squeeze them for every last cent of profit that you can get, uh, the only thing that would really stand in your way is your local bishop or your local priest. Because if you get too abusive, maybe your local bishop or your local priest is going to say, whoa, buddy, slow your roll. That's not what Jesus wants. Jesus doesn't want us to abuse the peasantry. Now, maybe you get lucky and your priest is willing to look the other way for a small bribe, right? There were quite a few corrupt clergy at this time, but there were also quite a few clergy that took their faith very, very seriously at this time. In modern circumstances, we look at people, who are promoting a new church, promoting things like Christian energy drinks, like people have totally mingled Christianity and capitalism to where a lot of people go into the clergy now as a money-making venture, right? And so we've adopted kind of a natural cynicism towards the clergy in general. Like people, come up with this idea of like we say, we'll think of a corrupt megachurch pastor, and we all think of that. We're all coming up with an image of a guy like Joel Osteen, right? But that's not really the case in the medieval world. In the medieval world, there were people who went into the clergy with nothing but good intentions, who went into the clergy because they deeply cared about their faith and their God. And we see several medieval priests and bishops take huge risks, risking potentially their life to take on the excesses of the elite against the poor. What's an example of this? Well, remember the Emperor Theodosius I. Towards the end of the 4th century, Theodosius I ordered his troops to massacre about 7,000 Thessalonican peasants. Obviously, that's not what Jesus would want, right? Jesus doesn't say massacre your peasants. And so Bishop Ambrose, St. Ambrose of Milan, actually holds the Emperor Theodosius to account. He actually excommunicates the Emperor Theodosius. And excommunication is the worst possible thing. If you are a Christian, you would rather almost have your head chopped off than be excommunicated. And I'll tell you why. If you die while you are excommunicated, you go straight to hell. Your salvation has been revoked. You are going straight to hell. And people really, really, really believed that hell and demons were real. Like, they took it for granted. And so the thought of getting a one-way ticket to hell is really freaking scary if you're living in the medieval or late Roman world, right? Nobody wants to go to hell. It doesn't sound like a good time. So that doesn't mean that Ambrose necessarily was going to win this face-off with the emperor, right? The emperor could be like, well, you're going to excommunicate me. I'm going to have you killed. But that's not what the Emperor Theodosius does. Theodosius actually goes to Bishop Ambrose and begs him to lift the excommunication. And he goes through basically kind of a hazing ritual. Ambrose makes him, do all this crazy stuff to demonstrate just how sorry he is for ordering those peasants to be killed. And after the emperor does this, Ambrose lifts the excommunication, which means that you're allowed to go back to church, you're allowed to receive communion again, and your, one-way ticket to hell has been revoked. You can get back into heaven. So I'm sure the Emperor Theodosius sighed a huge sigh of relief, right? Well, what does this mean for your local peasant? If your local peasant feels like he's being abused by his landlord's taking too much of his crops, he doesn't have enough crops to feed his family, he can go complain to the bishop, and the bishop, if he's a good, upstanding guy, may have some choice words with the landlord about this. And so the church does act as kind of a moderating force on the worst excesses of the land-owning elite. Now, if the priest is corrupt and the priest is like, hey, the peasants were telling me that you're being a little too mean, do we need to excommunicate you? You could just be like, well, you could excommunicate me, or you could take this huge pile of gold and silver and use it to invest in your church, use it to, maybe hire some nice looking prostitutes. I mean, some of these clergy were really corrupt, just as some of them were really, really hardcore about the faith and protecting the poor. Some of them were on the far other end, and they just were very cynical about it and willing to take bribes and whatever, right? It's a spectrum. So our Roman couple, Marcus and Secunda, they have gone to the countryside. They are looking for a landowner to basically allow them to work the land and become serfs. One of the other advantages that these landowners had, part of the way that they were able to attract people, is that these landowners were really the only people that had enough money to hire soldiers. And this is a real factor that you're going to consider. You're going to consider when you're trying to decide which landlord's land you want to go work on. You're going to consider, well, which landlord is going to be able to protect me from bodily harm. Italy, as you will recall, has been invaded by dozens of groups of barbarians. In the last 150 years, we've had people from Attila to Alaric to Theodoric come into Italy and attack the countryside. And, their soldiers are not always being very nice to civilians. There's no concept of war crimes at this time, right? And so soldiers would just totally take people's stuff. They would capture people, sell them into slavery. They would kill people just for the fun of it. I mean, if you're a soldier, you're under a tremendous amount of stress. And if there's no war crimes conventions, the way that you're going to vent that stress is by taking it out on the local populace. So if you're heading into the countryside and you're looking for agricultural labor, you are wanting to find someone who can defend you. Because some of these villas, some of these country manors are becoming fortified because there's all these roving barbarians around, right? And eventually these villas become so fortified that eventually they develop into what we recognize as like early medieval castles, right? Because there is just so much violence going on due to the conflicts between the collapsing Roman state and these resurgent barbarian kingdoms. There's so much violence going on that landowners started investing a lot of money in making sure that their houses didn't get burned down. And landowners that were like, hey, if you become my peasant, if you become my serf, I will take I've got 20 goons on my payroll, right? I will send my bruisers to go out and protect you and make sure that you don't get attacked by roving barbarians, right? And so there was a safety element in play that did make some landlords more attractive than others. If a landlord could promise you safety, you'd want to work on his land. So let's say our Roman couple, Marcus and Secunda, let's say they find a landlord. The landlord's like, hey, I'll give you this land. You can work it. I'll only take, if you have a good harvest, I'll take 10% of the harvest, and I'll only require that provide 10 unpaid days of labor a year. I don't know how accurate those numbers are. I'm pulling those off the top of my head. But let's say that's the arrangement that's proposed. Marcus and Secunda, they're like, well, it's between this or starving, and we'd rather not starve, so we're going to start a family and become medieval serfs. Okay, so the first thing you've got to do if you're a medieval serf, you've just been given your land, you've got to build a house. Sometimes there might be a house on the land if another family had lived there previously, but a lot of the times there wouldn't be, especially because a lot of new people are becoming serfs. There's a huge rise in the population of serfs, which means that there's not enough structures to inherit. So Marcus and Secunda, well, the first thing they've got to do is they've got to build a house. And until they're done building their house, they are sleeping in the open, right? They are sleeping potentially under the stars. Okay, well, what do you do once the house is built? Well, almost as soon as the house is built, you've got to start planting your crops, right? Because if you don't get your seeds in the ground in time for the harvest to come in before winter comes in and kills all the plants, you're going to starve, right? You are still living on a knife's edge, still trying very, very hard to make sure that you have enough food to feed yourself and your wife. And then guess what happens because there's no contraceptives? You guys are having unprotected sex. Your wife is getting pregnant just a few months after you get married. And so that's even worse, right? Because now you have an extra mouth that's coming on the way that you've got to prepare for, right? And your wife, because she's pregnant, she can't help you in the fields, right? She's got to be in the home. She can't be doing hard labor. But that doesn't mean that she gets like a get out of work card, right? She's still working and supporting the family. Well, how is she doing this if she can't work out in the fields? She's taking up what we would call a domestic trade. In the medieval world, there were like four main domestic trades that women really went into. Women serfs, I mean. Mending, weaving, crafting, and brewing. Brewing is a big one, especially in the later medieval period. We see a lot of women in the 1200s, 1300s go into brewing, and some of them actually become very successful at it and can become quite wealthy because of it. And this causes a problem for their husbands who feel a little strange about the idea that their wife is providing for the family more than they are, right? But that's more of a later medieval phenomenon. In the early medieval period, if, say you're living on a farm that's got some sheep, you might go into weaving, you might weave some wool and then sell some garments at the market to get some extra cash to buy things that you can't make yourself. Things like horseshoes, nails, these are things you'd have to pay a blacksmith for. You may want to buy a new cart. You've got to hire a cart maker for that, a carpenter, I should say. You may want to get a new animal for the farm that you would buy from a herder, right? And so there is an incentive to kind of engage in a little bit of monetary exchange. It's not all you're not all doing self-sufficiency stuff. You are trying to produce some goods to sell to have a little extra spending cash. But most of what the family produces is going to be used by the family. So if you are a pregnant serf, you may be investing your time in making clothes for the new kid. You may be investing your time in preparing the house for the new kid. You may be investing time in producing goods that you can sell so that you can buy things for your kid, buy toys and such, right? And so even though the wife isn't working out in the field, she's still very much involved in this domestic enterprise in setting up a successful family. She's still working, right? There is still work happening. We have this image of, medieval women, they didn't work, whatever. Medieval women worked a ton. These are not stay-at-home moms by any means. It's like they're taking care of the kids, but at the same time they're running the family business, like taking goods to market, producing goods, selling goods, things like beer, wool, clothes, whatever it is, right? So, but Marcus is still under a lot of pressure. A Roman man is still under a lot of pressure because now a baby's on the way, and he's got to make sure his crops get in the ground. He's got to make sure that the harvest is good. He's got to make sure that all this is going to happen. And that's a lot of stress to be under because there's so many things that could go wrong. If it's a little colder than it should be, your crops all die, you starve. Locusts come in, they eat your crops, you starve, you die. You get sick, you starve, you die. Roving barbarians come through and they defeat your landlord's, gang of goons. And so all of a sudden you're at the mercy of these barbarians. Or the landlord decides that he doesn't actually care that much about you and he's not going to risk his men defending you. And so he lets the barbarians take your stuff. Right? So much could go wrong. You are one bad luck event away from starvation and death. How do you mitigate this? Well, there's a religious aspect to it, right? There's so much out of your control, but everything's in God's control, right? So you get really pious about it, After your full 12-hour shift in the fields, you are praying multiple times a night. You may be waking up multiple times a night to pray or to recite a psalm that you've memorized, right? There were other means of kind of controlling some of these uncontrollable factors. We like to imagine that Christianity is the end all be all of the medieval world. And while that is true to a certain extent, if you're living in medieval Europe, medieval Christianity had a lot more paganism kind of embedded into it than modern day Christianity does. And so a lot of, pagan beliefs were rolled into early Christianity. Sometimes this could be we could be seeing pagan gods basically being rebranded as Christian saints. We talked about this in our episode on Saint Bridget. One of the other things is basically the Christianization of the magicians and the sorcerers. Now, if you've read the Bible, you would know that the Bible explicitly forbids magic, it forbids sorcery. But a lot of medieval people couldn't read, and even if they could read, they didn't have access to the part of the Bible that condemns magicians and sorcerers. And so, if you're a farmer and you're out there busting your ass trying to feed your wife and kid, and you know that if anything goes wrong, you are going to starve, all of you are going to starve and die, well, what do? You will go see your priest, sure, but maybe you need a little extra help. That's when you go find a local magician, a local sorcerer or sorceress. A lot of these people were women, as we know. And so you would go and you would pay this magician and sorcerer, and these magicians and sorcerers, they might do a spell to the old pagan spirits, right? They might do a spell to your ancestor spirits. They might do a spell to Jupiter or Minerva, some of the old pagan gods, right? Belief is still very much in flux, and the pagan gods were still very much real entities in the 500s AD, even though publicly sacrificing to them was illegal. The fact that it's illegal means that there were still people who were doing it that the Christians felt like they had to put a stop to, right? But your magician may also be something of a Christian magician, right? He may do spells that summon angels to watch over your farm. He may do spells that call saints calls the attention of dead saints to your farm. So the saints will be up in heaven and they'll be watching out for you and making sure that you do okay, right? People would do spells that would do things like expel devils, summon angels, that kind of thing. And this magician, especially if it's a woman magician, may have also been believed to have been able to ensure a good pregnancy and a safe childbirth. Childbirth is incredibly risky, and this is an everyday thing that was very, very deadly, because in Roman society, the only time, and to a lesser extent Italian medieval society, the only times that women were really valued and affirmed by their neighbors, by their society, was when they were getting married and when they were pregnant and giving birth, right? And so it's possible that if you are a 13, 14, 15-year-old Roman wife, right, and you are giving birth, or you are pregnant, I should say, you're receiving a lot of attention that you've never received before in your life. And that could feel really, really good, right? I mean, this is a society that does not value women, does not value their opinions. And so, for the first time in your life, really experiencing some kind of positive attention would feel really, really great. But at the same time, you are also keenly aware that there is a very good chance that either you or your baby is not making it out of childbirth alive. This is something that in living in the Western world, especially if you come from something of a wealthier background, is hard for us to understand. I mean, we can't imagine what it would have been like to have known. I mean, imagine having known. Uh, Imagine if, say, half the girls in your high school class had died in childbirth by the time they turned 40, right? Imagine what it would be like to live in a world like that. These maternal mortality rates in the ancient Roman world and the medieval world, they are high. And infant mortality is also high. There's so much that can go wrong. When you're giving birth, your body is experiencing a ton of stress. The baby is also very vulnerable to infection. There's one paper I read that was looking at vitamin D deficiencies in people giving birth and how this may have affected maternal mortality rates in the medieval world. Because we've also got to keep in mind that these people are not eating balanced diets. There's no prenatal vitamin boosters, or they're not taking their vitamins. They're eating bread and they are eating soup. Your your diet, if you are a medieval person, it is bread, it is soup. There are a lot of varieties of soup, but it's soup, usually old soup, because they would just keep soup on the fire for days on end, and they're like, well, it's on the fire, so it's good. So you could be eating 2-3 day old soup and some stale bread, and you're like, wow, this is great, I'm so full. And then you're washing it down with some beer, or maybe if you're living in Italy, you're lucky enough to afford some wine, right? You're not getting a bunch of clean water. You're not getting your fruits and veggies in, right? It is grain. If you're lucky, you're getting some protein with some meat, but that's expensive. It's mostly grain, if we're being honest. So no balanced diet. No antibiotics by any means. Nobody's washing their hands. In the heyday of the Roman Empire, there was something of a public sanitation system, right? They had these basically public latrines, but they didn't have any understanding of germ theory, and so these public latrines were very a lot of disease, we have to assume, was transmitted there, right? You're not washing your hands. You have a communal sponge that everybody is using to wipe their ass after they take a dump, right? So germs are being passed around like crazy. And if a physician, say, they get lucky enough, right, or a Roman couple, they get lucky enough to afford a physician to come take a look at the pregnant wife, the physician may have just seen a corpse, right, may have just administered to a dying person who is dying of a severe illness, goes straight from that to taking care of the pregnant mom without washing his hands. Directly bringing those germs over. So much could go wrong. But let's assume that it doesn't, right? I want our hypothetical Roman couple, who I've named Marcus and Secunda, again as a reminder, I want them to have a happy life. So we're going to assume that the pregnancy goes fine, that the wife gives birth, and both her and the baby survive. Let's talk about what the childbirth process would have been like. So typically, if you're a woman giving birth in the medieval world, you are going to need a lot of help. And this is actually when female friendships really become critical. And I don't mean critical in like it's important for your mental health. I mean, if you are a woman and you did not have a close female friend to help take care of you while you were pregnant and giving birth, you could die. It was literally a matter of life and death. People would rely on relatives as well. Say our Roman couple, the wife may have some sisters, right? She may be able to send a message to these sisters, ask them to come help her prepare for the childbirth. Her mother may still be alive, right? Ancient Roman and medieval women who survived giving birth to multiple children, they tended to live longer than we really give them credit for. It would not have been necessarily strange to see a woman living into her mid 70s or late 80s. I mean, you would say that's an old lady, she's going to die soon, right? But you were aware of the possibility. It's not like everybody turned 40 and dropped dead, right? People could live well into their 60s if they, especially if they're women, if they made it out of their childbearing years without dying as a result of pregnancy or childbirth. So Secunda, while she's giving birth, she's tended either by a female friend or a female relative. If you are wealthier or you live close by a convent, you may give birth in a convent. Nuns get very good at taking care of women and children in the medieval world. I mean, they're really the only people that are really set up to have anything even close to like a modern day maternity ward. It's actually nuns. A lot of people will travel to convents to give birth in convents because the nuns, they see it as their Christian duty to take care of the mother and the child. And so even women who get pregnant outside of wedlock, which is frowned upon in medieval society, obviously, they could still be taken care of by the nuns and still get a lot of support. We actually see in these medieval miracle stories, which do get written down, and it's in these miracle stories that we find some of our most honest, authentic accounts of medieval life for the average person, because usually saints they're not performing miracles for the rich as much as they're performing miracles for the poor. And so we do see some accounts of the poor who are telling these miracle stories to priests that are writing them down, right? We do see something of an honest accounting of the average person's life through these stories. Medieval miracle stories, a lot of miracles get performed to help pregnant women and women who have just given birth, right? There's a lot of miracles involved in this whole pregnancy process. And the miracles are performed for married women and unmarried women who are pregnant, which shows that whether or not you were married or unmarried in medieval society, if you were pregnant, you were believed to be worthy of having a miracle performed, right? Pregnancy was viewed as this kind of essential thing. And so pregnant women had a certain degree of respect. People knew that they were doing a hard thing, a potentially deadly thing, and so they did respect that to a certain degree. Now, not to the extent that they're like, oh, hey, we're going to treat you as an equal citizen under the law, right? You're still a woman, you still have no rights, but you are experiencing a level of admiration, right? Anyways, childbirth goes great. Wife, kid, and husband, they get the first harvest in. Things are going well. They're going to bear many children over the years, right? Again, contraceptives aren't a thing. So the wife is going to be pregnant multiple times. And, if she is lucky enough to survive all of her pregnancies, we can definitely say that, probably as much as 25% to 50% of the children that she bears will die before reaching adulthood, right? Childhood disease is a real concern. Children are naturally susceptible to disease. Their immune systems aren't that great. But we're going to assume that at least the wife and husband, they have at least a couple kids that survive into adulthood. The husband actually is going to pass on his contract, his status as a serf. He's going to pass that on to his eldest son. So when he dies, his eldest son inherits the tract of land that he's working on, and he also inherits the contract with the Lord. And so now, after the father dies, it's the eldest son who gets the land, but who also has to make sure that the Lord is getting the rent, and also make sure that he's doing his 10 required days of unpaid labor for the Lord every year, Well, what about the second son and the third son? What happens to them, right? Well, they've got to go find their own landlord who's going to enter them into their own contract as a serf. Either that, or they have to go to the city, see if they can make their way there, right? Which, I mean, that's pretty bleak because Rome is still shrinking in population at this point. So it's not like a whole lot of people are making lucky breaks in the city, right? Or they can, maybe they can see if they'll be accepted by any monastic schools. Maybe they can become a monk, maybe they can become a priest, or they can become a bandit, pillager, or soldier, right? But most of them end up becoming serfs, either somewhere on that same landed estate or somewhere very close by. People aren't traveling very far at this stage. Well, what about the daughters? The daughters are getting married off, and they're getting married off in exchange for gold, in exchange for gifts, right? The our early medieval dad in this situation is trying to find someone that's going to be able to take good care of his daughters and also maybe pay him a little money for the privilege of taking care of his daughters, right? And if you're a good husband, you're going to make sure, or if you're a good father, I should say, you want to make sure that your daughters are all married to men that can reasonably provide for them. Now, maybe one of your daughters is going to come to you and say, like, hey, I really, really like this boy that works on the neighboring farm, and I want to marry him. Um, maybe if you're a nice dad, you're like, okay, you're not shooting it down right away. You're like, well, let's see if this boy can provide for you. Let's see if he's going to be able to take care of you. And if he can, maybe you let your daughter marry the man of her dreams, right? But she still needs your permission, and so if for any reason, doesn't matter how much she loves him, let's say this guy isn't able to pony up a sizable dowry, and the 60-year-old guy from across the road is able to give you 5 goats as a dowry, you've got to make an economical decision. And you're like, well, listen, I know you like this other guy, but he doesn't have 5 goats, so you're getting married to the old guy. And again, these girls were like 13, 14, 15, so not really a great time for them. Yeah, anytime we talk anytime we talk about Roman society, women in Roman society, it gets really bleak really fast. I'm actually excited to cover women that are living in these barbarian societies because they actually, comparatively, compared to Roman women, they had way better lives. It'll be nice to talk about something other than like societal misogyny, rampant societal misogyny for a bit. But anytime we're digging into Roman society, I mean, we've got to talk about this stuff. It was a part of everyday life, and any attempt to gloss over just the deep, deep, deep systemic hatred of women, any attempt to gloss over that would be selling you a fairy tale, and that's not what we're here to do. We're here to talk about history, right? So, our husband wife couple, all the kids have grown up. The girls have been married off. The boys have gone off to find their own farms, make their own fortunes, whatever, right? You die, you're buried in the churchyard, right? Your priest should, if he's doing his job well, he should be seeing to it that you receive a proper Christian funeral, you're receiving the proper rites. And over time, your kids and your grandkids may visit your graves in that same churchyard. Your grave is going to be marked, if you're poor, by some sort of wooden marker. And it's possible that, in a few centuries, that wooden marker is going to be the only sign that you were ever alive. We live now in like modern day surveillance state. We're voluntarily letting companies record all kinds of data about us, right? And so it's hard for us to imagine what it would be like to live in a society where the only thing between uh, someone's existence being totally forgotten, and I mean totally forgotten, where like no one ever remembers that they were ever alive, is a wooden grave marker in a church cemetery. I mean, that's so bizarre. It's so hard for us to wrap our minds around us. Because the only people that are getting really remembered are the people, like I said, who can pay to be educated and write things down about their life, or they can pay for, inscriptions of their deeds to be set in stone, which will last the ages, right? But your average person can't afford that. And wooden markers, they break down, they fade, they rot. And so if you are a average medieval serf and you've died in the 6th century, within 100 years, nobody is going to be able to remember your name. Maybe one of your great grandkids knows from the story that his dad told him that his great grandfather was named Marcus, or that his great grandmother was named Secunda. Maybe nothing happened. Maybe that knowledge is able to be passed down orally from generation to generation, but over time it fades. And as soon as that grave marker rots away, all sign of your existence is gone. Now, medieval people made their peace with this because they believed in the eternity of the soul. They believed that after you died, you were going either to heaven, hell, or purgatory, right? And so they don't seem to have gotten all too wrapped up in this idea that, like, oh, I'm gonna die and nobody's gonna remember me, and all trace that I was even here is gonna fade away. They don't seem to have gotten too wrapped up in that, because they took it for granted, really, that there was an afterlife, right? It was so societally embedded that people took it for granted. They took it as fact that there was an afterlife that they would go to, that they would experience, right? But we in the modern world, we don't necessarily take it for granted that there's an afterlife, right? We live in a world of science and reason, and things that are supernatural, things that can't be proven, we tend to doubt, right? And so for us, it is deeply, deeply sad anytime a person dies, and it is even worse when a person dies and they are forgotten, because that means that all that they ever were, all that they ever hoped, all that they ever dreamed, all that they ever loved, all that ever made them cry or rage, all of that is gone. And you're gonna have to forgive me for quoting Blade Runner here, but there's that scene where he talks about the android talks about all of his memories fading away upon his death, like tears in rain. And I think that's probably the best metaphor to really describe what's happening when medieval people died, and the people that knew them died as well. They were forgotten. Their experience was wrapped into the great big mass of human experience that has always, or hopefully will exist for thousands more years, right? And anything that would distinguish them as an individual would also fade. And I kind of hate to end our episode on a more depressing note, right? But that's where we're ending, I hate to say. So next week, we're going to be diving into the barbarian invasions of the island of Britain. We're going to be talking about the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and I'm really excited about this because anyone who knows me knows that my strong suit is in medieval British history. Now, there are plenty of podcasts on the Anglo-Saxons. There's the British History podcast, which I love and fully endorse, right? And so I'm not gonna be focusing too much on this area, but I do want to do at least a couple episodes talking about the what's going on in Roman Britain and early barbarian settlements in Britain, and so we will be talking about that. We'll be talking about legendary figures like Hengist, Horsa, King Arthur, and talking about what the changes from Roman Britain into a Britain now, where instead of being united under the Roman Empire, it's divided up into several different barbarian states. So we'll see you next week. If you enjoyed what we talked about this week, I really hope you will leave a comment or subscribe, or if you want to go to the website and check out the sources, I always put bibliographies there. I'll link that in the show notes. You can also check us out on social media, share us with your friends. I don't know. I mean, we just broke almost 400 downloads on this podcast. That's way more than I ever thought it would get, if I'm being honest. And I'm super grateful for that. And I do kind of want to see how big we can get. So yeah, this is also our first video podcast. If you are on a format that supports that, you're seeing me sitting in my living room with my cool historical artwork. I hope you think it's cool. And yeah, we'll see you next week when we'll be diving into the Anglo Saxons.